I'd like to welcome everybody to another installment of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. Of course, I am your host, Melissa Howes-Whitecross, for those of you who don't know me. And I just wanted to let everyone know that we are aware that our illustrious president will be giving an address this evening, and we won't hold it against you if you nip off to go and catch what he has to say. We will be recording the webinar this evening, so if you do happen to miss any of it because of the presidential address, you can follow up with us on YouTube and you'll be able to catch up on what Christina has to say tonight. Just some Zoom 101. Those of you who are new to the platform, you'll see in your Zoom windows that there is a Q&A and a chat box. These are the two methods that you have available to you to communicate with Christina and I while the webinar is going on. Christina is going to be taking questions at the end of the talk, but obviously if something does catch your attention throughout our talk and you'd like us to address it, just pop it into the Q&A box while you're thinking of it, and we'll tackle those at the end of Christina's talk. I'd like to welcome Christina Hagen, our Pamela Isdell Fellow of Penguin Conservation. Christina is an incredibly passionate conservationist, and we are really, really proud of the groundbreaking work that she's been doing on the African penguin down in the Western Cape, and she's going to be telling you all about that this evening. Now, Neville and Pamela Isdell, we're going to be joining us from Barbados. I'm not 100% sure if they are in the Zoom room or not, but if they are, a huge welcome to the two of you. They are also honorary patrons of BirdLife South Africa, and we are extremely, extremely grateful to the support that the Isdells have shown our organization over the years, and of course, sponsoring Christina's penguin work at the forefront of that. Now, Christina, you are probably going to do a better job of introducing yourself than I will, so I'm going to hand over to you and let you tell everybody exactly who you are and how you fit into the BirdLife picture, and then we can proceed on with your show. Welcome, Christina.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Melissa. I'm excited to share my work with everyone, and thanks everyone for joining us tonight. I know there's a number of webinars that are happening this evening, so thanks for choosing this one. Yes. So I am the Pamela Isdell Fellow of Penguin Conservation. My position is funded by Pamela Isdell, as the name would suggest, and my role is basically I'm leading on BirdLife South Africa's attempts to create new penguin colonies. I've been working at BirdLife for just about 10 years now, so it's quite hard to believe, but it's been an amazing journey for me, starting out straight from my MSc from the Fitzpatrick Institute, and then where I did a thesis on Cape gannets, and then moving almost straight into African penguin conservation. So I'll just get started. Our African penguins are in dire straits. We have lost 99% of the population since the turn of the 20th century, and that resulted in them being listed as endangered in 2010. More recently, the population trend has continued to show a decline, with a decrease of more than 60% over the last 30 years, which is very worrying, and something that we're working as hard as we can to try and halt. So the reason for the decline, there are many. Some are still ongoing, some are more historic, and two of those historic threats are egg collecting and guano harvesting. So egg collecting was a big factor in the early 1900s up until about the 70s. Same with guano harvesting, actually. It's estimated that almost half the eggs laid on Dawson Island were collected for human consumption. And guano harvesting also has been halted in South Africa, luckily, but that has a continuing legacy of a suboptimal breeding habitat for the penguins. They used to make their burrows in this very thick layer of guano that was on most of our offshore islands, and now they are forced to nest on the surface, which leaves them vulnerable to predation and extremes of temperature, as well as flooding and other weather events. Another threat is seal predation. It's very hard to quantify how big a threat this is because it happens out at sea, but we do know that around some of the colonies, especially, the seals kind of lie in wait for penguins to return to the colony from foraging, and that's when they go for them. And then obviously oiling is also a major threat to the penguins. Luckily, we have some good rehab organizations working on this problem, and they're ready to jump in whenever there's an oil spill, and also they do some really good work continuously looking after our penguins. But by far the biggest threat is a lack of food. So penguins eat sardines and anchovies, which are these small shoaling fish. Collectively, they're called small pelagic fish or forage fish, and they kind of form the base of the food chain in the Benguela region in South Africa and Namibia. And the reason that the penguins are facing a food shortage is because of a shift in distribution. So most of the penguin colonies are on the west coast, and there's 2 in Algoa Bay in PE. And the west coast is where most of the sardine and anchovy stocks were found historically, and that is also where most of the fishing occurs. And from about the mid-90s, the stocks of sardine and anchovy shifted from the west coast onto the kind of southern coast. And that's a big problem for penguins because they can only forage about 40 kilometers away from their breeding colony because they need to be able to return at regular intervals to feed their chicks. And with the stocks shifting, there is no longer enough food around the colonies, which makes them go further or have to abandon their nests. And unfortunately, because of for economic reasons, the fishing industry has continued to fish predominantly on the west coast because that's where the harbors and the processing facilities are. So the penguins and the fishery are targeting the same fish, and those fish have now moved away from the historic grounds. So that resulted in very large decreases in population, especially on the west coast. So that's where we come in with the idea of establishing new colonies on the south coast in areas of high fish abundance. So some people have asked me, this is quite a drastic conservation intervention. Why are we doing this now? And the answer is that we need to take action because we're losing our penguin population almost by the day. And sorry, my slides aren't advancing. There we go. In 1999, there was a workshop where it was first proposed or suggested that we look at starting to create new penguin colonies. And the penguin population was about 40,000 pairs back then. And at that time, it was decided that it was too drastic an intervention. It wasn't warranted at that time. Fast forward to 2010, when the penguins were listed as endangered, and that's when BirdLife first started looking into establishing new colonies. The population had dropped down to almost 20,000 pairs. So that's the reason that we want to start now before we continue to lose any more penguins. And I don't think I mentioned earlier, but the current population in South Africa is about 13,000 pairs, which is really worrying. So I'll just take you through the process that we have been through since 2010 to try and create new penguin colonies. So we started out with a small desktop study looking at potential sites and very broad sort of feasibility questions. We didn't really manage to do much more work on it since in 2011 and 2012 because we didn't have funding. In 2013, Pamela Isdell came on board as a patron of the Penguin and gave us our first donation that allowed us to run some feasibility workshops and site selection workshops. So we basically brought together a whole bunch of penguin experts and stakeholders to look at broadly whether this was even feasible for the African penguin, and to look at choosing some potential sites. And that took place over about 2 years, and we eventually came out with 2 possible sites, one in Plettenberg Bay and the other in the De Hoop Nature Reserve. So there was a long process of looking for sites and looking at those 2 that we kind of shortlisted. In 2015, we took a decision to work in the De Hoop Nature Reserve. We continued working in Plet, doing some fish surveys and predator monitoring, but we decided to focus on the De Hoop Nature Reserve because it actually was the site of a natural colonization attempt, and I'll get onto that a bit later. And also we needed to focus on one due to resource constraints and time and money constraints. So 2015 we kind of made that decision. 2016 and 17 were all about putting in proposals and doing risk assessments. We worked very closely with Cape Nature, who runs the reserve, to get their buy-in and support, and wrote a management plan for the colony and how it would be run and what we would do in certain situations, kind of like a decision tree of how we would manage the project. That was approved in 2018. Which meant we were able to start installing the infrastructure that would let us establish the colony, and I'll go into that in much more detail later on. 2019 was a year of monitoring and seeing that the processes that we put in place were functional. And 2020, who knows what that will bring with COVID-19. A lot of my plans have been had to change slightly, but again, I will get onto that a bit later in the talk. So to introduce you to De Hoop, the site that we're working at is on the very eastern edge of De Hoop. I've just realized I didn't put a map in, so for those of you who are from an international audience, De Hoop is about 4 hours, or I guess 300-ish kilometers from Cape Town to the east. And this site is at the very edge of the De Hoop Nature Reserve, the very eastern edge. And it is the site where penguins naturally tried to colonize in the mid-2000s. A few pairs were found, and I think the colony went up to about 18 pairs by about 2006. And there were lots of other penguins kind of loafing around and just roosting at the site. And then unfortunately, before any management could take place, a leopard also discovered the penguins, and predation caused them to abandon the site. But we decided that because the penguins had already chosen this site, we knew it was suitable for them. And if we could protect them from predators, it would be a very good spot for them. So I'm going to run through kind of the thought process that we went through to establish this colony. So the first thing was to determine the feasibility of whether we could even establish a new penguin colony. And it has new colonies, or restoring old seabird colonies has been taking place around the world for a number of years now, and it's an increasingly used conservation tool, especially in Australia and New Zealand. So a whole suite of species have been worked on. So I think the most well-known one might be the Atlantic puffin in Maine, where an extinct colony was re-established, but also a couple of species of albatross, Australasian gannets, various burrowing shearwaters have also been established, and common terns as well, Caspian terns and common murres. And there's been various degrees of success, and I've done quite an in-depth study to look at what factors made the successful ones successful. Not many attempts have been made to establish penguin colonies. Flying birds are obviously a bit easier because they can travel further than penguins that have to swim. So there is a project ongoing in Australia with little penguins, and I've heard anecdotal stories of an attempt being made in Peru with Humboldt penguins, but I don't have all the details of that. But we hope that we can learn from these flying seabirds. Another reason we think that it's feasible for African penguins is that the penguins themselves have started new colonies. They obviously tried to establish the colony at De Hoop, but in the mid-1980s, 3 colonies started almost simultaneously or within a few years of each other, and naturally by the penguins. So obviously the most famous one being Boulders Beach in Simonstown, and the other one is Stony Point near Betty's Bay. And Robben Island was also recolonized by the penguins. They bred there in the 1700s, and that colony went extinct because of humans, and it was also re-established in the 1980s. Obviously, Boulders and Stony Point had never had penguins breeding there before, so that was a novel breeding site, and they are also mainland colonies, which we want to learn from as well. The next step was to try and address the threats to the penguins in the area that we wanted to try and establish the colony in. I do have a map, so Cape Town is here, De Hoop Nature Reserve is, well, this whole block is Nature Reserve, and the colony site is where the star is. And as I mentioned before, one of the biggest threats to penguins is a lack of food. So one of the first questions we had to ask was, is there enough food for the penguins in this area? And luckily, the Department of Fisheries did a fish survey in the area in 2016, a very fine scale survey around the colony site. And you can see the dark red, almost black patches are very high densities of fish. So that was a very good sign. And the Fisheries Department also does 2 surveys a year along the whole coastline of South Africa. And consistently in those surveys, we see patches of high fish abundance in the area around De Hoop. So that was a very good sign. Another good sign for that there was good fish availability in the area is that my colleague Andrew de Block has put satellite trackers or GPS trackers on penguins from Dustin Island and Stony Point, and this was outside of the breeding season, so they're free to travel a lot further. And several of them went around Cape Agulhas and foraged in the area around De Hoop, as you can see from the tracks. And so that was a very good sign that they were going to this area to forage, because these birds had just finished breeding, so they needed to fatten up again before they molted. So this was a very good sign that there's enough fish in the area for a new colony. The next step was that there are some significant logistical, practical challenges. Because it's in a nature reserve, there's no electricity, and also there's no cell phone reception. So we put in some solar panels to run some of our electronic equipment, and we also put in satellite internet so that we could monitor the site remotely through CCTV cameras, and also to run the electric fence that we had to put up. So that was quite a challenge to find solutions and people who would work in a remote area such as De Hoop. The fourth challenge was to manage our native predators. Because it's in a nature reserve, we need to try and conserve all the biodiversity. We can't just manage the site for penguins. So we put up some camera traps before we kind of got started working at the site, and did confirm that there were indeed leopard in the area, which was both exciting to see the photos and a bit scary, because we knew that we would have to find a way to keep them out of the area. So I want to also emphasize that we want to manage them rather than like there can be no lethal control, because leopards are also a protected species. A lot of the seabird colonies in places like Australia and New Zealand also have predators, but they're all introduced predators. So it's kind of, in a way, easier to manage in those countries. But our camera traps also showed that there were a bunch of other animals that would potentially cause problems for penguins. Caracal in the top left corner, baboons would probably go for chicks if they could find them, but they would definitely just cause havoc with any equipment that we had out in the colony. And then also genet and mongoose, they are known to take penguin eggs and chicks at Stony Point and boulders. So we would have to be able to keep all these animals out. So the solution to this was to build a predator-proof fence, and that we did in 2018, October 2018. So the fence is of quite a small area. It's about 2 hectares, big enough for a fair-sized penguin colony, but not so big that it would cut off a lot of the foraging areas for those predators that we want to keep out. So the fence is about 2.4 meters high. It's got an overhanging electric strands at the top, as well as an offset with electric wires at the bottom to prevent any burrowing under the fence. And yeah, it's about 300 meters long. And obviously it has to end at the sea. So we tried to use the topography as much as possible to also create a physical barrier where the fence has to end at the ocean. So once we had all that set up, the next challenge is obviously to get the penguins to colonize. And to do this, we are using a technique that's called social attraction. And that basically plays on the fact that penguins, like most seabirds, breed in colonies, perhaps not as dense as the photos that I'm showing on the screen, but most seabirds breed in colonies because there's safety in numbers, as well as various other benefits to the birds breeding there. So in trying to attract penguins to the site, we want to make the area look and sound like an existing penguin colony. So one of the first ways in which this has been done elsewhere in the world is to use decoys, lifelike models of the birds that make it seem like there's already a colony. So you can see on the screen there's Laysan albatross decoys, puffin, and Australasian gannets. And the Laysan albatross decoys that you can see on the left there, it was found that, so that study they tested 3D models as well as 2D models and ones in static postures, like the ones in the background, as well as ones that were kind of more displaying. And they found the 3D displaying models were actually more effective at luring birds to come and settle next to them. So we tried to learn from this, and we actually put out a call on Facebook for anyone to help us make some decoy penguins. And a local Cape Town artist called Rolf Darling answered the call, and he made us some amazing penguin decoys. You can see there on the right with the clay model. And then we chose two postures, a standing one and a lying down one. We decided not to go with a kind of more displaying version, as we wanted the penguins to look relaxed and kind of settled. And so it was very exciting the day he finished working on the decoys and sent us our African penguin colony starter kit. And so we had fun unloading the decoys in the office and making a little penguin army. Once the decoys had been made, we decided to actually test out the reactions of real penguins to the decoys. So Cape Nature allowed us to do this at Stony Point. We took the two decoys in the foreground there and put them out in the colony just to see how the penguins would react. We had quite a few penguins walking past, and most of them kind of just looked at the decoys, and one that you can see behind the two decoys actually kind of lay down and looking a bit confused the whole time, but it lay down next to the decoys for about 5 minutes, which was really exciting to see. The point of doing that test was just to check whether the penguins were aggressive towards the decoys, or if they'd completely ignored them, that would also have been a bad thing. But luckily, the test was a success, and we were able to go and put them out at the colony site. And we have I think about 30 of them out there now, placed in various positions along the peninsula, in areas that we think the penguins will be able to see from the sea. The second part of social attraction is also to make it sound like a penguin colony. And so we have some speakers out playing the lovely braying call of the African penguin. And we think that this is quite important because the penguins, because they're quite, they're on the water, quite low down, they probably won't be able to see the decoys as well as they would have if they were able to fly. So hopefully the sound will lure them in close enough to be able to see the decoys. So all that has been set up at the site since about January 2019. And in conjunction with Cape Nature, we decided that we would leave that out for about a year in order to test whether it would work to attract the penguins in. So far, it hasn't. Penguins are seen in the waters around De Hoop in general fairly often. There's a marine protected area, so there are patrols in the protected area quite regularly, and they often see penguins. So that's a very good sign. We just need to let them know that there's a home waiting for them. So what's next for this project? The second method that is used to try and attract or try and establish seabird colonies is chick translocation. And that's been used quite commonly for a number of seabird species. You can see it's a short-tailed albatross on the left, a cute little baby puffin on the right at the bottom, and then this was the project that I mentioned earlier with little penguins in Australia. So the idea behind moving chicks is that most seabirds display what we call natophilopatry, which means they go back to the area that they were, the colony that they were born in or hatched in. And then once they start breeding there, they return to that colony site year after year. Most seabirds breed with the same mate every year, and the only way that they can find that mate again is to go back to the same colony, and very often the same exact nest every year. So by moving chicks, hopefully before they have imprinted on their natal colony, then they'll go out to sea and mature, and often seabirds only become reproductively active quite late in life. Some, like albatrosses, only at 10 or more years. Luckily with African penguins, it's only about 3 to 5 or 6 when they start breeding. So the idea is to move chicks there, and they get released and go to sea, and there's often a prospecting phase where they go and look at various different colonies and then decide on somewhere to breed. And hopefully with the combination of the colony, the Hope site looking like a penguin colony, and the good food abundance, the penguins will choose to come back to the colony site. So that's the next step. We are working with Sandcob, who hand rear chicks that have been abandoned in various colonies, and then they get released once they're ready to fledge. So instead of releasing them at existing colonies, they would then be released at Hope. So we're working on all the plans and permits for that to happen, and depending on what happens with COVID will, I guess, depend when we are able to start releasing birds there. But hopefully it will be pretty soon. So that's kind of the project in a nutshell. I'd like to thank again Pamela and Neville for their ongoing support of the project, and they fund my position and all the infrastructure and everything that's gone into the site. Also the Shalfin and Minerva Trust, they've funded this project, and they fund our broader penguin work that's working on addressing the fishery impacts on penguins. And this project is very much a collaboration with various partners that you can see on the screen. So I'd just like to thank them as well. And that's it for me. I'll take any questions.
Thanks so much, Christina. What a fascinating story, and certainly it's been one hell of a journey for you in setting this whole thing up. And I know that everyone at BirdLife is really excited to have the penguins return to that site. So before we launch into any questions, just to remind everybody that in a moment you'll see the QR code on the screen. That little QR code links to a donations tab. There we go. If anybody is wanting to support the production of these webinars and some of the penguin work and some of the other conservation work that we're doing at BirdLife South Africa, you're more than welcome to either give that a scan or just go down to the website below it, cricket.co.za, and you can support BirdLife's work through that channel. You can also visit our website if you'd like to know more about our organization and some of the other conservation work that we do. You can also support us through becoming a member, and we always do value the members that we do already have. So thank you to those of you listening that are members. Just before Christina kicks off onto the questions, I see we have quite a few. Just to remind everybody that we've got our next webinar next week. Samantha Ralston-Payton is going to be talking about the myths and misconceptions about wind energy and its impacts on birds. Definitely a talk not to be missed, and you can register on our website for that talk. And then, of course, tomorrow night, our Better Birding webinars. I see Dave and Mike were tuned in. They're going to be doing part 2 of their photography workshop. So any avid bird photographers that are out there, this is definitely one to join in. Michael Mason is going to be chatting with them. So without any further ado, let's jump into some questions. Christina, we've got quite a few. So I don't know if you can see the Q&A screen there. I'll just launch you off with the first one. We've got a question from Sybil Guzman, and I apologize if I got the pronunciation wrong there. She's asking fish stock shifting. Why do you think that is? Is it a climate-driven reason, or are there other reasons as to why the fish stocks have shifted?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Climate change has a role to play. There is evidence that sea surface temperatures are warming, and that has affected where and how successfully the fish spawn. We're not 100% sure of all the reasons. The marine environment is very complex, and it's hard to pin down exactly why it's happened. There is also the impact of fishing. There has been historically quite high fishing pressure on the west coast, and that has possibly also contributed in conjunction with the environmental changes.
Great, thanks, Christina. We've got another one asking, in the graph that you showed earlier, what caused those 2 peaks in around 2002-ish and 2005-ish in terms of the population trend of penguins? And that's asked by Amy Horn.
Yeah, and so that was as a result of a spike in the fish abundance in over kind of 2002 to probably 2005-ish. The penguin population tracks the fish abundance very closely, so those years were really good for fish abundance, so that translated into good years for penguin abundance.
Great. Letitia's got one asking, was a site in the Eskom Reserve between Oyster Bay and Cape St. Francis considered as an additional breeding site? If yes or no, please comment on the motivation.
No, I'm not familiar with that site. I would be happy to learn some more. We did try to find as many potential sites as we could. Obviously, we have quite a long coastline, so we can't look at it all. We were focusing on areas of either headlands or peninsulas that would be kind of easier to fence off, to have a short fence area compared to the land area that you were protecting. If you want to contact me and send me that location, I'd be happy to look into it. We're always looking for ideas. If De Hoop is successful, we would like to expand into other areas as well.
Great. Bronwyn Klaas has asked, I'd like to know if the new colony area at De Hoop is protected from fishing to prevent a similar competition for fish in future.
Yeah, so currently it is a marine protected area, but this only extends 5 kilometers from the coastline. So the entire area that the penguins would use for foraging isn't protected, but that is something that we are looking to address.
Great. I'm going to jump across to Facebook quickly. And Robert Campbell is asking, what aspects of disease spread have you investigated or threats they hold to the new colony? That's a good one in terms of our corona condition right now.
Yes, exactly. Very topical. So disease is obviously a big thing to consider when you're moving animals around. I'm not a disease expert, but SANCOB and the other rehab centers are very well informed on what penguin diseases there are and seabird diseases in general. Any birds that get released go through a very strict health screening before they get released to ensure that they're not carrying any diseases and that they're healthy and won't spread anything into the environment. So we'll just use the existing protocols that are already in place.
Great. And then we've got one in the chat room as well from Craig McFarlane asking, what degree of success have you seen with the birds released in new locations, if they remain in that new home, or do they tend to move back to their old home ranges?
So we haven't actually released any birds in totally new locations yet. They currently get released in existing colonies. And there's been interesting patterns of movement. So all the chicks that get released, all the fledglings that get released, have a transponder chip in them. So it's a very similar microchip that you would have in your pet. And there are various readers at colonies that are able to log when a penguin returns to that colony. So all the fledglings have those implanted before they get released. And we're just starting to get the data coming in now. This program was really only set up in 2015, and it's being run by SANCOB with Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. So once they are released, the fledglings do just leave the colony, and they spend about 3 or 4 years at sea before they decide where to breed. And there's been quite a mix of some birds returning to their natal colonies, some birds returning to the colony where they were released from, if that wasn't the same as their natal colony. So it's a bit of a mix, and we're still trying to get to the bottom of penguin movements and why they choose to go where they go.
Super. Thanks for that question, Craig. Then I'm going to ask you 2 questions in one. The first is Sybil's, how many decoys have you deployed? And then Catherine, tuning in from California, hello Catherine, is asking, what are the penguin sounds repeated on a continuous loop at the colony?
Yeah, so we have about 30 decoys out at the moment. It's very hard to know how many we need to kind of simulate a colony. Probably, maybe we do need a few more. So if anyone's interested in sponsoring a decoy, they can get in touch. And yes, the calls are played on loop 24/7. Yeah, when I'm at the colony, I often switch them off for a short time if I'm doing work there, because it's quite distracting.
I can imagine, as we all experienced a couple of minutes ago. All right, Amy Horn's got one. If the penguins from the western colonies are moving across to near De Hoop in the non-breeding season in order to forage for enough food, wouldn't starting a colony in De Hoop reduce the viability of the western colonies because they will have to travel even further east for sufficient food?
No, I don't think so. I don't think the colony at De Hoop would have a big enough impact on the fish stocks to affect the viability of the penguins going there to forage from western colonies. It's obviously very hard to say what will happen, but I don't think it will be a problem.
Great. And then Doug Davidson's got a question asking how the translocated chicks will be fed. Are they able to feed themselves?
Yeah, the chicks are released at an age when they would naturally fledge from a colony, and once chicks leave their natal colony naturally, they aren't reliant on their parents for feeding, so they just go off and feed for themselves. They do sometimes try and forage with adults to kind of learn from them, but they are pretty self-sufficient.
Great. Then answering off the back of that question, Amy's asking if there's a particular time of year that would be optimal for releases once permits are sorted.
Yeah, this is also something that we're not 100% sure of. Obviously, the releasing them at a time when fledglings would naturally be leaving penguin colonies would be good. African penguins have a very extended breeding season, so and it varies along the coastline. I think in Port Elizabeth they start breeding in sort of March or February even, and then in the Western Cape it's more like April, May, or even June, and it extends until September. So fledglings would be kind of leaving most times of year. So I think we would target sort of the later part of the year from August, September, October.
Okay, brilliant. And then Caroline Walter from the Netherlands is asking whether artificial nest boxes could perhaps also attract the penguins to the potential nest site at De Hoop.
Yeah, that is something that we have considered, but we have decided not to do that yet. There are plenty of kind of natural or naturally protected areas in the colony. Penguins will breed under almost anything. They breed in under boulders, and there is some sand sand that's kind of held together by roots, vegetation roots, so they'll be able to dig their own burrows. So there's enough nesting area for the colony. Obviously, if it gets really big, which we would love, then we would have to put in some artificial nests, but from the kind of early stages, there's definitely enough natural nesting potential.
Great. We've got one on Facebook from Rainier Mayers. He's asking if there's a reason why the Boulders Beach penguins are wandering around Simonstown.
Yeah, I think that's, well, they do have penguins wandering around on the roads even outside of lockdown, so it's not that unusual. I think possibly the penguins will be doing it more now because there are no cars, there's very little disturbance. So let's hope they don't get too used to it, and then when the cars come back, they have had quite a problem with roadkill in Simonstown. So if you do live in Simonstown, or if you visit there, please drive carefully and watch out for penguins when we get out of lockdown. Yeah, so they do wander around normally, but I think during lockdown they'll just be a bit bolder because there's not much disturbance.
So there's a question here as well from Paul asking if tourists affect the population numbers at all, and I think it's probably a good one to answer after that.
Yeah, so it's quite difficult to know the answer to this as well. The penguins at Boulders are quite habituated to people. If you compare their behavior to penguins that breed on islands, the penguins at Boulders are much less scared. They'll continue their normal activities with people right next to them, but there is probably an internal physiological stress response that doesn't translate into a behavioral response. So while tourism doesn't seem to outwardly affect them, it may have some underlying effects that we don't know about. So that's why it's good to have most of our colonies not accessible to tourists. And I should mention before people get their hopes up that once the De Hoop colony gets going, we won't allow any tourism for at least the first 5 years to allow the penguins to get properly established. We wouldn't want to scare them away while they're still getting used to the site.
Great, thanks. And then Chris is asking, you mentioned the number of pairs in South Africa. Do we know what the total population estimate is for the global population?
So penguins, African penguins are only found in South Africa and Namibia. So South Africa is about 13,000 pairs. Namibia is about 5,000 pairs. So 18,000 in total. That's, why we're worried. Considering that there were 140,000 pairs in the 1950s.
Yeah, definitely concerning. We got another one on Facebook from Robert asking, have you investigated the marine predators angle?
The marine predators at De Hoop.
Yes.
So seals are in the area around De Hoop. I don't think, unfortunately, we can find an area to create penguin colonies that won't have seals nearby. The seal population recovered very well after seal culling was stopped and hunting of seals was stopped in South Africa. So they are quite widespread. Unfortunately, we won't be able to find an area that doesn't have seal predation. Other than that, we haven't looked into any other marine predators. We do know that sharks do sometimes go for penguins, although it's quite difficult to know how big a problem this is because it happens at sea. I think sharks probably tend to go for seals more than penguins because they have a nice thick layer of blubber, the seals. Yeah, so we do know that there are seals around, but we haven't done any quantitative assessments of that. It will be very hard until we do get penguins there to be able to study what the impact is.
Great. Then Cynthia's asking, she's saying that she's very impressed with the work, but she'd like to know how climate change has impacted the great initiative of this penguin project and how you've tried to manage these climatic factors in your work.
Well, part of the rationale, which I didn't mention, of establishing the colony is to try and help the penguins adapt to climate change. So climate has almost certainly played a role in the shifting of the fish stocks. And so this is to try and help them respond to that. Also, there's a limit to how far the penguins and the fish can spread. So I think Port Elizabeth is probably the limit for of where penguins will be able to breed in South Africa. They won't be able to breed any further east than that. So their range might contract a little bit. So we're trying to help them move into the center of that range in an area that has good food availability. In terms of the other impacts of climate change, obviously sea level rise is an issue, and that will affect all our penguin colonies and all our seabird colonies, actually. But hopefully on the mainland, they will be able to retreat further inshore as the sea level rises, and there is space to do that at De Hoop. Yeah, I think, and then obviously increasing temperatures by providing, well, because there are good nesting opportunities that are under rocks, and if we put out artificial nests, that should hopefully help with increasing temperatures affecting breeding.
Great. Yeah, climate change certainly is a big challenge for all our species and we humans too. So that's something we're going to have to really think carefully about going forward with all our conservation work, Christina. We got a question from Barbara Wood asking, are you going to pursue the Plettenberg Bay site at a later stage?
Yeah, we've done quite a bit of work there, looking at fish abundance and predator abundance as well. It's a bit more tricky in Plet because there are humans, so we'll need to work out access, and we don't want to impinge on people's access to coastal areas, but also we need to protect the site for penguins against all the predators. So it's a bit of a tricky situation there, and so we've decided to work at De Hoop and kind of use that as a pilot study to see how that goes, and then look at the feasibility of Plet and any other sites that potentially get suggested.
Fantastic. And Nancy's got a question here asking, assuming things go well, what is the expected carrying capacity of the new site?
Yeah, good question. And hoping that things do go well, probably about, so that is the one downside of the De Hoop site, is that it's fairly small, possibly about 300 pairs, which is, so Boulders is around 1,000 pairs, to give you a bit of context. But the real value of De Hoop is kind of a proof of concept and getting the techniques down to see if we can actually do this in a site that we know the penguins chose naturally.
Great, and let's hope that it does go well. We've got one from Sasha asking, do African penguins breed ex situ? So are there any established in zoos, and could such populations serve as backup? So I think that links very much to what our friends at Sandkop are doing. If you want to elaborate a bit more on that, Christina.
Yeah, so penguins do breed pretty well in captivity. I think actually a lot of our captive institutions in South Africa are at capacity because the penguins are breeding really well. So that is a good, potentially a good source of birds to release for starting the new colony. There are some concerns or things that we would have to take into account before that goes ahead. The Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries has requested a risk assessment be done for releasing captive bred birds, because we don't know, if they will be any different behaviorally, or if they'll be able to survive in the wild as well as their wild bred counterparts. So that is a process that's ongoing. But yes, they are potentially a source of birds to release.
Great. And then on to someone who is actually based at a zoo. We've got Yopi Kuhn joining us from San Diego Zoo, and he's asking, are there any preliminary results from the placement of these decoys and the vocalizations? Any interest from the wild population?
Sadly not. We did have an increase in the number of swift terns or greater crested terns roosting at the site, which was really nice to see. When the colony first established naturally, there were a lot of Cape cormorants, white-breasted cormorants, and greater crested terns either roosting or breeding at the site as well. And that's one of the factors that we think helped in the establishment of Boulders and Stony Point, is the fact that there were other seabirds breeding and roosting there already. So having the swift terns come to De Hoop is a very good sign, and hopefully they'll also provide a clue to the penguins that it's a safe spot to come and breed.
Great. So another double-barreled question for you, Christina. I'm just going to try and find both of them. So the first one is, are there opportunities for conservation students to get involved with this kind of work, whether it be monitoring, or I don't know if you have any other ideas? And then also Nicholas is asking, when you go into bird conservation, do you spend time with the wild birds like in ornithology, or is it more work behind a desk?
That is a very good question. I think a lot of people who go into conservation do it because they love the outdoors and being out in the field. I think it just depends on what job you're lucky enough to get. My job currently entails a lot of desk work because it's getting the permits and reports and everything sorted for getting the permission to translocate the penguins. But I do get to go out into the field to the colony site quite regularly, which is always fun and a nice change of pace. So I think it just depends on what role you or what job you get in the field of conservation. And the other question about opportunity for people to get involved. Currently, there isn't a huge amount of scope. We have some really good remote monitoring systems set up. So we have CCTV cameras along the fence line to monitor the area continuously, and I get alerts when there's movement on the cameras. So that does cut down on the need for physical monitoring, unfortunately. But if there are any opportunities and I do need help, I will put out a call on our social media platforms for people to get involved.
Thanks, Christina. I see Dave Roberts has just put on here, if people want practical experience with penguin conservation, SANCOB does offer internships. I'm sure you can just Google SANCOB's contact details, or Dave, if you can throw them into the chat box, I'm sure people can grab them there. Then we've got BirdLife asking a question. I'm assuming this is our big sister, BirdLife International. Thanks for tuning in. At one point, residents around Boulders Beach were fairly anti their beach being taken over by penguins. Is there still some bad feelings towards them, and has there been any negative impact?
I'm not too sure what the current sentiment is, but I do know a few years ago there was some anti-penguin sentiment, because the penguins only arrived in the 1980s, I think around 1983, and some people had their houses there for many years before that, and so the penguins were kind of taking over their beach. I think a lot of that has kind of calmed down a bit, but I don't live in the area myself, so I'm not sure what the current sentiment is. But I would personally be very happy to have penguins in my backyard.
I'm sure you would, Christina. We've got a question from Leslie Hoy asking, a while back he saw some posts about deaths of penguins in Namibia. Was this mystery ever solved, and how would that impact the penguins in South Africa?
Yeah, I think probably what you saw was there was an outbreak of avian influenza in Namibia, well, in South Africa as well. Luckily, in South Africa, African penguins weren't too badly affected. It mostly seemed to affect the swift terns. And then a few months later, I think there was an outbreak in Namibia, and there, unfortunately, the African penguins were much harder hit up there. David Roberts actually can probably answer that a lot more knowledgeably than I can, as he's a vet at SANCOB. But yeah, probably what you saw was in relation to avian flu.
Super, thanks, Christina. And leading off of that, Stanley Harvey's asked, what are the most common diseases found in penguins? I'm not sure if you know that off the top of your head.
I don't really know that off the top of my head. I would defer to David if you want to put anything in the chat room.
Yeah, Dave, you're welcome to answer that one for us if you don't mind, and I'll read it out on air. Thank you for putting on SANCOB's details there. I see they are in the chat room now. We've got a question here from Denise Potgieter asking, what is the status of the colonies at Algoa Bay?
Yeah, so Algoa Bay currently, I think, holds more than half our penguin population. So there's two main colonies in Algoa Bay, St. Croix Islands and Bird Island. And kind of for the last few years, they were doing really well, especially St. Croix. I think there were more than 8,000 pairs there, but in the last few years, St. Croix has been decreasing as well, which is a real worry for us. And we think that it's linked to the increasing development that's happening at the Kruger Harbour. And there was also a major increase in shipping traffic due to ship-to-ship oil bunkering that's taking place there. So we are working with a bunch of other organizations, SANCOB, WESA, Nelson Mandela University, to put together a task force to look at what's happening in Algoa Bay, because that's kind of the stronghold of the penguin population currently. So we need to try and safeguard that.
Definitely. Thanks for that update, Christina. I see our big boss man has asked, would it be useful to have tern and cormorant decoys at the site as well? Thanks, Mark, for that question.
Yeah, that is actually something I was thinking about the other day, to put out other seabird decoys to try and get them to come, and by them being there to attract the penguins. So yeah, that's definitely something I'll look into. Maybe I'll contact Rolf and see if he wants to make some more decoys for us.
Definitely. And then Mike's asking if we're aware of any effective patrols in that sort of 5-kilometer marine protected zone that are taking place.
So I know that Cape Nature does a regular patrol in the marine protected area. They're responsible for managing that area. I'm not fully up to speed with everything that they find in that area. I do know that there has been sort of a lot of fishing along the edges of the marine protected area, which is allowed, but also has an impact on the protected area. But yeah, definitely Cape Nature does patrol fairly often.
Great. And then I suppose this kind of speaks to that as well from Marius Wheeler. He's asking, is progress being made between the various stakeholders to address fishing pressure along the west coast? And is closure of fishing areas around breeding sites still being implemented, and does that help?
Yeah, so this is the other kind of focus of BirdLife's penguin conservation efforts. So I kind of see this colony project as taking the penguins to where the fish are, and then the other kind of focus is ensuring that the fish stay where the penguins are, or that there are enough fish where the penguins are currently. So the manager of the seabird program at BirdLife, Alistair McInnes, is leading on this. We are working kind of with the fisheries department, and we sit on a working group that also includes the fishing industry and the government and environmental affairs, to look at how we can change the management of the fishery to make it kind of take into account the ecosystem needs a bit more. And that does include the long-term experiment that's been running, looking at the effectiveness of closing or preventing fishing around penguin breeding colonies. So that's been quite a long process and is quite, I guess, controversial. There's been a difference of opinion in how the data is analyzed, leading to a difference of opinion in results and the, I guess, efficacy of that conservation measure. We do think that it does have a benefit to penguins, and so we are pushing for the closure to fishing around all penguin breeding colonies. But yeah, it's been a long road. We still have a little way to go on that.
Yeah, we'll keep fighting the good fight for the penguins. Anthony's asking how the Stony Point colony is doing.
I don't have the latest numbers in my head, but it is one of the only colonies that has been stable for the last few years. So that's kind of good news for that colony. It is fairly small if you consider kind of the historical size of various penguin colonies. It's, I think, around 1,000 breeding pairs. But yeah, it has been stable for the last few years.
Great, that's good to hear. John Sparrow is asking, what are the sort of direct impacts that COVID-19 has had on your project so far? If you can share those with us.
Yeah, obviously I'm working at home. Luckily, there is a lot that I can do at home in terms of working on the reports and risk assessment for releasing the translocated penguins. Obviously, I haven't been able to get out to the site, so it's good that we have the remote monitoring set up. I check on the cameras every day, which is a nice little view into what's happening 300 kilometers away from me. Cape Nature is also, they're still operating and keeping the reserves running. So the Cape Nature Rangers have been going to physically check on the site as well. So it's not being totally kind of abandoned, which has helped my peace of mind that when they send me a message saying they've been and everything's fine. Yeah, so I guess the biggest impact is not knowing what the future will hold and what work we will be able to do in the next few months.
Definitely, really uncertain times ahead of all of us. I see Dave Roberts has very kindly answered our what diseases are most common in penguins. Thank you, Dave. So Dave is saying that diseases in wild penguins are not usually a population problem. They do get blood parasites, ticks, lice, and worms. The main threats are poor food availability and predators. A lot of the penguins that Sandcob gets are wild and are underweight or injured by predators. Thank you very much, Dave, for answering that for us. We've got one from V here, Christina, asking about whether there are any behavioral implications for these fledglings being released at different sites.
That is a very good question, and something that I wish we'd started researching like 10 or 20 years ago, because of the life history of penguins and taking so long to breed. Any birds that we release now will only start to return to colonies to breed in 3 or 4 or 5 years time. So that's a very long time to have to wait to get answers to your questions. From the chicks that the abandoned chicks that get hand reared and then released, that's been going on for probably almost 10 years now, but only for the last 5 or so has the transponder program really been going. So we're only just getting the data in now. So as far as we know, the penguin, and because of the transponder work, the chicks, the fledglings do survive as well as the wild penguins. So from that point of view, there's probably no impact on them being released at different sites, because the survival rate is about the same as their wild counterparts.
Great, that's good to know at least. Letitia's asking, considering a worst case scenario and the penguins don't colonize De Hoop, does BirdLife have a sort of plan B to help with the penguin survival?
Yeah, so plan B is kind of the plan that we're working on at the moment with our fishery interventions. Yeah, if it doesn't work at De Hoop, and unfortunately there's no guarantee that it will, but we'll do everything that we can to make sure that it works. Yeah, then we will focus on more of our efforts on the fishery side of things and making sure that they have enough fish at their current colonies.
Brilliant. Stanley Harvey's got a question. Have you noticed any interest by the local predators in the decoys?
So before we set up the fence and the decoys and everything, we had the camera traps out to look at what predators were around, and the leopards, we're not sure how many individuals we have yet. We would see a leopard quite frequently, coming sort of every 2 or 3 weeks, coming to the area. So we knew that they did frequent the area, and that pattern has kind of continued. The leopard comes and walks along the fence. Obviously, it can't get in at the decoys, but there hasn't been a major increase in the leopard or any other predators because of the decoys.
Good. Okay, and then we've got one last question here from Christo asking, when they move into a new site and there's not a high abundance in guano, what are the penguins using to build their nests?
So typically the guano is the substrate of choice for penguins. In colonies where there is no guano because it's been removed by humans, they breed. They still try and make burrows. They breed under bushes, under rocks. On Robben Island, there are a few abandoned buildings and sort of shipwrecks, and they even breed under there. So kind of anything that offers them some form of shelter, they will they will try and breed there.
Brilliant. Sure, that was a lot of questions. Thank you, Christina, for weathering all of those, as well as
No
to Dave
problem.
for his assistance on some of those. I just want to give Christina a huge congratulations. That was a fantastic webinar. I certainly learned a lot, and it looks from the comments that I'm seeing, it looks like everybody has really, really enjoyed that. So well done, Christina. Very, very impressive work, and keep it up. And we will keep our fingers crossed that those penguins return very, very soon. And there was just one other comment asking for a repeat of tomorrow night's webinar. That is the Better Birding webinars. It's run by Mike Buckham and Dave Winter. If you'd like to sign up for their webinars, you can jump onto their Facebook page, Better Birding, and you'll be able to find out all about that photography workshop tomorrow. And then, of course, don't forget, same place, same time, next week, Tuesday, we'll have Sam Ralston-Payton talking all about myths and misconceptions relating to wind energy and its impacts on birds. Thank you all. We are in time for our President's Address at 8:30. I hope everybody keeps safe. We are nearing the end of this first round of lockdown, and we'll see what the future holds for all of us. But just keep healthy, keep safe, keep your eyes on the sky and outside. There's birds all around us, and make sure that you're always enjoying and appreciating them. Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.